Have you ever found yourself working late at night in a place where anything could happen? I'm curious about where you're from and whether you've ever felt that particular kind of vulnerability that comes with being alone after midnight. Because Elena Vasquez knew that feeling intimately as she stocked energy drinks in the back cooler of Hassan's 24-hour convenience store. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cramped aisles filled with snacks, lottery tickets, and overpriced necessities that desperate people bought at 3 in the morning. Elena had been working the graveyard shift at Hassan's corner market for 8 months now, ever since her last relationship had imploded spectacularly and left her scrambling to make rent on her studio apartment. At 26, she'd thought her life would look different than this, but here she was, counting down the hours until sunrise while restocking shelves and dealing with drunks who stumbled in looking for cigarettes or energy drinks. Hassan Okafor was a good man, Elena reminded herself as she arranged the Red Bulls in perfect rows. The 60-year-old Nigerian immigrant had given her a job when no one else would hire someone without a college degree, and he always made sure she had pepper spray and kept the panic button within reach. He treated her like the daughter he'd never had, bringing her homemade jollof rice and asking about her life with genuine concern. The neighborhood wasn't the safest, but Hassan's store had been here for 15 years without any major incidents. Until tonight. Elena heard the bell chime as the front door opened, but she didn't think much of it. The late-night crowd was predictably unpredictable, ranging from hospital workers grabbing coffee between shifts to insomniacs buying ice cream. She continued stocking, humming quietly to herself as she worked, grateful for the overtime pay that would help her catch up on her electric bill. The store felt warm and safe with Hassan at the counter, his presence a steady comfort in an uncertain world. The voices that drifted back from the front counter made her pause. 3 men, speaking in low tones that carried an edge she couldn't quite identify. Elena wasn't naturally paranoid, but something about their conversation made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She moved closer to the stockroom door, staying out of sight while straining to hear what they were saying. "Give us everything in the register," one of them said, his voice muffled by what sounded like a mask. "The cash and whatever you keep in the safe." Elena's heart started racing as the reality of the situation crashed over her. This wasn't just late-night shopping. This was a robbery, and she was trapped in the back room with no way to escape except through the front of the store where armed men were threatening Hassan. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, trying to dial 911 while staying completely silent. "I don't keep much cash here," Hassan replied, his accented English steady despite the obvious danger. "You can have what's in the register, but there's no safe. I bank the deposits every day." Elena pressed herself against the stockroom wall, listening to every word while terror built in her chest like a physical weight. She'd never been in a situation like this before, never had to make decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Should she call the police and risk the noise giving away her position? Should she try to escape through the back exit? Should she attempt to help Hassan somehow? "Don't lie to us, old man," another voice snarled, younger and more aggressive than the first. "We know you keep money back there. Start talking or things get messy." Through the crack in the stockroom door, Elena could see Hassan's reflection in the security mirror mounted above the register. His dark face was calm but tense, his hands raised in a gesture of compliance. He was wearing the same blue shirt he wore every night, the one with the small stain near the pocket that he always meant to replace, but never did. The normalcy of that detail made everything else feel surreal, like she was watching a movie instead of witnessing a real crime. "I'm telling you the truth," Hassan said quietly. "Take the register money and go. There's maybe $200 there. I'm not going to risk my life over money." Elena managed to get her phone open and started dialing 911, but her hands were shaking so badly that she accidentally hit the wrong numbers twice. The third man, who hadn't spoken yet, moved into her line of sight. He was tall and broad, dressed in black with a ski mask covering his face, and he was holding something that made Elena's blood run cold. A gun, pointed directly at Hassan's chest. $200 isn't enough," the tall man said, his voice carrying an authority that marked him as the leader. "You've been skimming from our territory for months. Time to pay what you owe, plus interest." Elena realized with growing horror that this wasn't a random robbery. These men knew Hassan, knew his business, knew something about territory and payments that suggested this was about much more than the contents of a cash register. Hassan's face had gone pale, and she could see understanding and fear replacing his initial compliance. "I don't owe anyone anything," Hassan said, but his voice wavered slightly. "I pay my taxes, I follow the law, I mind my own business." The leader gestured with his gun, and Elena watched in terror as Hassan slowly opened the register. The mechanical sound of the drawer sliding open seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly silent store. Hassan began placing bills on the counter with hands that trembled just slightly, the only sign of how frightened he really was. "This neighborhood belongs to the Castellano family now," the leader continued, his tone conversational despite the weapon in his hand. "You want to keep operating here, you pay protection. You want to keep breathing, you pay what you already owe for the last 6 months. Elena's 911 call finally connected, but she didn't dare speak loudly enough to be heard by the operator. She whispered into the phone, giving the store's address and praying that help would arrive before something terrible happened. The operator was asking questions she couldn't answer without revealing her position, and she had to hang up and hope they would send police based on the little information she'd provided. Hassan finished emptying the register and stepped back, his hands raised again. "That's everything," he said with quiet dignity. "Now please leave my store." The leader looked at the money on the counter and shook his head slowly, like Hassan had disappointed him. "Not enough," he said simply, and Elena watched in absolute horror as he pulled the trigger. The gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space, and Elena clapped both hands over her mouth to keep from screaming. Hassan fell behind the counter, and she couldn't see him anymore, couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. The 3 men moved quickly, grabbing the money and speaking in urgent whispers about cleaning up and leaving no witnesses. Elena's world narrowed to a single desperate need to stay hidden and stay alive. She pressed herself further back into the stockroom, behind cases of soda and boxes of chips, praying that they would take the money and leave without exploring the rest of the store. Her heart was beating so loudly that she was sure they would hear it, and tears streamed down her face as she processed what she'd just witnessed. "Check the back room," the leader ordered, and Elena felt her last hope evaporate. "Make sure we're alone." She heard footsteps approaching the stockroom, and every instinct screamed at her to run. The back exit was only 15 feet away, but reaching it would mean crossing open space where they might see her. Staying hidden meant certain discovery when they searched the room. Elena made the only choice that offered any chance of survival and sprinted toward the back door. The crash of her shoulder hitting the emergency exit echoed through the store, and shouts erupted behind her as the 3 men realized they had a witness. Elena burst into the alley behind the store, rain immediately soaking through her uniform shirt as she ran blindly into the night. The pavement was slick and treacherous, and she could hear heavy footsteps pursuing her as she stumbled between dumpsters and abandoned shopping carts. "Stop running, or we'll make this worse for you," one of them shouted, but Elena couldn't stop. Stopping meant dying, and dying meant Hassan's murder would go unpunished. She had to escape, had to survive long enough to tell someone what she'd seen. The alley opened onto a side street that was completely deserted at this hour, streetlights casting pools of yellow light that seemed impossibly far apart. Elena's sneakers slipped on the wet pavement as she ran toward what she hoped was safety, but she could hear the men gaining on her. They were faster, stronger, and they knew she couldn't run forever. A black SUV appeared at the end of the street, moving fast enough that Elena thought it might run her down. She veered toward a cluster of parked cars, hoping to use them as cover, but the SUV stopped directly in her path. Elena expected more armed men to emerge, expected her situation to get even worse, but instead she heard gunshots from behind her. The pursuing footsteps stopped, replaced by sounds of violence that she didn't want to identify. Elena crouched between 2 parked cars, shaking uncontrollably as she tried to process what was happening. The rain continued to fall, mixing with tears and blood from cuts she'd sustained during her desperate flight. The driver's door of the black SUV opened, and Elena prepared to face whatever new threat had arrived. Instead, she found herself looking up at a man who moved with predatory grace but approached her with surprising gentleness. He was tall and lean, dressed in an expensive dark suit that somehow remained immaculate despite the rain and violence. His face was sharp and intelligent, with dark eyes that assessed her condition with what looked like genuine concern. "You're hurt," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that she couldn't immediately identify. His tone was calm, almost soothing, completely at odds with the chaos that had just unfolded. "Let me help you." Elena couldn't speak. The trauma of witnessing Hassan's murder, combined with the terror of being chased through dark alleys, had left her in shock. She could only stare at this mysterious stranger who had somehow eliminated her pursuers and was now offering assistance instead of additional threats. The man crouched down beside her, moving slowly to avoid startling her further. His dark eyes never left her face as he assessed her injuries, and Elena found herself noticing details that seemed absurd under the circumstances. He was handsome in a dangerous way, with the kind of controlled power that suggested violence was never far from the surface. But his hands were gentle as he examined the cuts on her arms, and his voice remained soft and reassuring. "My name is Dante," he said, producing a pristine handkerchief from his jacket pocket. "Dante Moretti. You witnessed something tonight that you shouldn't have seen, and now there are people who want to hurt you because of it. I can protect you, but you need to trust me." Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Hassan," she managed. "They killed Hassan." Dante's expression darkened, and for a moment Elena saw something lethal flash in his eyes before it was replaced by careful control. "I know," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry. Hassan was under my protection, which means his death is my responsibility. That also means your safety is now my responsibility." Elena didn't understand what he meant by protection or responsibility, but she could see the blood on her arms where she'd scraped against brick walls during her escape. The cuts stung, and her clothes were soaked through with rain and fierce sweat. This stranger named Dante was offering help when she desperately needed it, and the alternative was trying to survive on her own against people who had already proven they were willing to kill. Dante helped her to her feet with careful hands that supported her weight without making her feel trapped or constrained. He guided her toward the SUV, and Elena went with him because she couldn't think of any other option. As they reached the vehicle, she looked back toward the alley where her pursuers had disappeared, but saw no sign of them. Whatever Dante had done, it had been swift and final. "Where are you taking me?" Elena asked as Dante opened the passenger door for her. "Somewhere safe," he replied, and something in his voice made her believe him. "Somewhere you can heal from what you've seen tonight. Somewhere no one will hurt you again." Elena settled into the leather seat and watched Dante move around to the driver's side. She still didn't understand who he was or why he'd been in the right place at the right time to save her. But as the SUV pulled away from the scene of violence and terror, she felt the first tiny spark of hope that she might actually survive this nightmare. The man beside her radiated danger, but for some reason she felt safer with him than she had all night. As the city lights blurred past the window, Elena closed her eyes and tried not to think about Hassan's last moments or the sound of gunshots in the rain-soaked alley. Tomorrow she would have to process the trauma and figure out what came next, but tonight she was alive because a dangerous stranger had chosen to protect rather than harm her. That would have to be enough for now. Elena had expected many things when Dante Moretti brought her to his home, but she hadn't expected the penthouse to feel like stepping into another world entirely. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city that sparkled like scattered diamonds against the dark sky, while expensive furniture and artwork created an atmosphere of refined luxury that seemed impossible after the violence and terror of the night. The contrast was so stark that Elena wondered if she was dreaming, if trauma had finally broken her mind and created elaborate fantasies to escape reality. Dante guided her through the spacious living area with the same careful attention he'd shown in the alley, one hand resting lightly on her lower back to steady her while avoiding any gesture that might feel threatening or constrictive. Elena noticed everything with the hyper-aware clarity that shock often brought, from the subtle scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker that might have been gunpowder, to the way he moved with predatory grace even while showing her such gentle consideration. "Sit here," Dante said, indicating a plush sofa position to take advantage of the spectacular view. "I need to clean those cuts before they get infected." Elena sank into cushions that probably cost more than her monthly rent, watching as Dante disappeared into what she assumed was a bathroom. She could hear water running and cabinet doors opening, the domestic sounds oddly comforting after hours of fear and adrenaline. Her hands were still shaking, and she clasped them together in her lap to hide the trembling while trying to process everything that had happened. Hassan was dead. The thought hit her like a physical blow every time her mind circled back to it, and she had to fight waves of nausea as she remembered the sound of the gunshot and the way his body had fallen behind the counter. He'd been a good man, a kind man who'd given her a job when she needed one and treated her with more respect than her own father ever had. Now he was gone because three masked men had decided his life was worth less than whatever money they thought he owed them. Dante returned carrying a first aid kit that looked far more comprehensive than anything Elena had ever owned, along with a bowl of warm water and several clean towels. He set everything on the coffee table with practiced efficiency, and Elena found herself wondering why someone who lived in such obvious luxury would be so comfortable treating wounds. The question died in her throat when he knelt beside the sofa and reached for her left arm with careful hands. "This might sting a little," he warned, his voice soft and matter-of-fact. "You scraped yourself pretty badly on that brick wall." Elena watched his face as he cleaned the cuts on her arm, noting the concentration in his dark eyes and the gentle precision of his movements. His hands were larger than hers, with long fingers and calluses that suggested he was familiar with physical work despite his expensive clothes. There was something almost hypnotic about watching him care for her injuries, the way he dabbed antiseptic on each scrape and cut with meticulous attention to detail. The antiseptic did sting, just as he'd warned, but Elena found the pain grounding in a way that helped anchor her to the present moment. She was alive, she was safe, and this dangerous stranger was treating her wounds with more gentleness than she'd experienced from anyone in recent memory. The combination of trauma and kindness was doing strange things to her emotional state, creating a vulnerability that scared her almost as much as the men who'd chased her through dark alleys. "You're very good at this," Elena said, needing to break the silence before her thoughts spiraled into even darker territory. "Do you have medical training?" Dante glanced up at her, and something flickered across his face before he returned his attention to her injuries. "You learn to treat wounds when violence is part of your world," he said simply. "I've had plenty of practice." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. The casual way he spoke about violence made it clear that tonight's events weren't unusual in his life, and she began to understand that her rescue hadn't been random. This man moved through a world where guns and death were normal, and somehow she'd stumbled into his sphere of influence at the worst possible moment. "Who are you?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "I mean, why were you there tonight? Why did you help me?" Dante finished cleaning the cuts on her left arm and moved to examine her right side, where she'd scraped her ribs during her desperate flight. He helped her lift her torn uniform shirt enough to assess the damage, his touch completely professional despite the intimacy of the situation. Elena found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the sharp angle of his jaw and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. "Hassan Okafor was under my protection," Dante said without looking up from her injuries. "He paid for safety in a neighborhood where safety doesn't come free, and I failed to provide what he paid for. That makes his death my responsibility, and it makes your safety my responsibility as well." Elena's breath caught as the implications of his words began to sink in. Protection payments. Territory. The masked men's talk about owing money to the Castellano family. Hassan hadn't been the victim of a random robbery at all. He'd been caught up in some kind of criminal power struggle, and now Elena was caught up in it too simply because she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. "You're talking about organized crime," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're talking about the Mafia." Dante's hands stilled for a moment, and when he looked up at her, his dark eyes held a kind of weary honesty that was more frightening than any threat could have been. "I'm talking about the reality of how certain parts of this city actually work," he said quietly. "Hassan knew the risks when he chose to operate in contested territory. You didn't choose anything, which is why what happened to you tonight is unacceptable." Elena felt the room spinning slightly as she tried to reconcile the man gently bandaging her wounds with someone involved in the kind of criminal enterprises she'd only seen in movies. Dante seemed too refined, too controlled, too genuinely concerned about her welfare to be the monster she imagined when she thought about organized crime. But his casual mention of protection payments and contested territory suggested he was exactly what she feared. The men who killed Hassan, Elena began, then stopped as her throat tightened with emotion. Are they going to come after me because I saw what happened? Dante finished applying antibiotic ointment to her scraped ribs and helped her lower her shirt before meeting her eyes directly. Yes, he said with brutal honesty. You're a witness to a murder that was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong. They can't let you live to testify about what you really saw. The simple statement hit Elena like a physical blow, and she felt tears building behind her eyes as the full scope of her situation became clear. Her normal life was over. Her job, her apartment, her routine, everything that had defined her existence just hours ago was now impossible because 3 men in masks had decided Hassan's life was worth less than their criminal agenda. But they're not going to find you, Dante continued, his voice taking on a quality that made Elena look at him more carefully. Because you're under my protection now, and I take my responsibilities very seriously. There was something in the way he said responsibilities that sent a shiver down Elena's spine, something that suggested his protection came with a price she didn't understand yet. But as he began wrapping gauze around her cleaned wounds with practiced efficiency, Elena found herself studying his face and wondering what kind of man could be so gentle while speaking so casually about violence and death. I don't want to be part of this world, Elena said, surprising herself with how small her voice sounded. I just want to go back to my normal life. I want to call the police and report what I saw, and then go home and pretend none of this happened. Dante secured the last bandage and sat back on his heels, his expression patient but firm. The police can't protect you from the kind of people who killed Hassan, he said gently. And if you try to go back to your normal life, you'll be dead within 24 hours. These aren't random criminals, Elena. They're professionals who eliminate threats to their organization, and you're now a threat simply because you can identify them. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she had since childhood. The comfortable world she'd built for herself, modest as it was, had been destroyed in a matter of hours. Her independence, her self-reliance, her carefully maintained distance from anything dangerous or complicated, all of it was gone because she'd been working the night shift when killers decided Hassan had outlived his usefulness. What does your protection mean? Elena asked, needing to understand what she was accepting. What happens to my life now? Dante rose from his kneeling position and sat beside her on the sofa, careful to maintain enough distance that she didn't feel trapped, but close enough that his presence was reassuring rather than threatening. His dark eyes held hers as he spoke, and Elena found herself focusing on them to avoid thinking about everything she was losing. It means you stay alive, Dante said simply. It means the people who hurt Hassan will face consequences for what they did. And it means that anyone who tries to hurt you will discover that some things in this world are more dangerous than they ever imagined. There was something in his voice that made Elena believe every word. Something that suggested his promise of protection wasn't an empty gesture, but a commitment backed by resources and capabilities she couldn't begin to comprehend. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt the first sense of safety she'd experienced since hearing voices in Hassan's store. What kind of consequences? Elena found herself asking, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Dante was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried a quality that made Elena's breath catch. Every man who hurt you will disappear by morning, he said with calm certainty. Every person who threatens you will learn that you're untouchable. Every enemy who thinks they can use you to get to me will discover they've made the last mistake of their lives. The promise was terrifying and comforting in equal measure, delivered with such quiet conviction that Elena had no doubt he meant every word. She was looking at a man who could make people disappear, who had the power to eliminate threats with the kind of efficiency he demonstrated in the alley. The knowledge should have sent her running, but instead she found herself leaning slightly closer to him, drawn to the safety he represented even as her rational mind screamed warnings. Elena's phone buzzed against her leg, startling her out of the strange spell Dante's words had cast. She fumbled for the device, expecting to see a text from a worried coworker or maybe her landlord asking about next month's rent. Instead, the screen showed a number she didn't recognize and a message that made her blood run cold. We know where you live, Elena Vasquez. We know where you work. We know you saw everything tonight. You have 12 hours to disappear, or we'll finish what we started at Hassan's store. Elena's hands started shaking so violently that she almost dropped the phone. The message proved everything Dante had said about the danger being real and immediate. These people knew her name, knew her address, knew exactly who she was and what she'd witnessed. There was no going back to her normal life because her normal life no longer existed. Dante took the phone from her trembling hands and read the message with an expression that grew progressively darker. When he looked up, Elena saw something lethal flicker in his eyes before it was replaced by careful control. This confirms what I suspected, he said quietly. They've already tracked your identity through the store's employment records. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks as the full reality of her situation finally penetrated her shock. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built for herself, all the careful independence she'd maintained, it was all gone. She was completely dependent on a dangerous stranger for survival, trapped in a world she didn't understand by circumstances beyond her control. Dante moved closer and pulled her gently against his chest, his arms coming around her in a way that felt protective rather than possessive. Elena found herself melting into his embrace despite everything her rational mind was screaming about trusting dangerous men. His expensive shirt was soft against her cheek, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm that seemed impossibly calm given the chaos surrounding them. I know this is overwhelming, Dante said softly, his voice rumbling through his chest. I know you're scared and confused and angry about having your life turned upside down. But you're not alone in this. I meant what I said about protection, Elena. You're mine to keep safe now, and I take that responsibility seriously. There was something about the way he said mine that should have set off alarm bells, but instead Elena found it oddly comforting. She'd been alone for so long, handling every crisis and setback by herself, that the idea of someone else taking responsibility for her safety was almost intoxicating. Dangerous, perhaps, but intoxicating nonetheless. What happens now? Elena whispered against his chest, afraid to pull away from the first sense of security she'd felt all night. Now you rest, Dante said, his hand moving to stroke her damp hair with surprising gentleness. Tomorrow we'll deal with the men who threatened you. Tonight, you're safe here with me, and that's all you need to worry about. Elena closed her eyes and tried to believe him, tried to find peace in his promise of protection even though accepting it meant stepping into a world she didn't understand. As exhaustion finally began to overtake adrenaline, she found herself thinking that maybe being claimed by a dangerous man wasn't the worst thing that could happen to someone who'd lost everything else. At least with Dante, she might live long enough to figure out what came next. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the disorienting sensation of silk sheets against her skin. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her ribs ached with every breath. But then the events of the previous night crashed over her like a cold wave. Hassan's murder, the chase through dark alleys, Dante's unexpected rescue, and the terrifying text message that had shattered any illusion of safety in her normal life. She sat up carefully, wincing as her bandaged wounds protested the movement, and took in her surroundings with the kind of hyper-aware attention that trauma often brought. The guest bedroom where Dante had settled her for the night was larger than her entire studio apartment, decorated with the kind of understated luxury that spoke of serious money. Original artwork hung on cream-colored walls, and a sitting area by the windows included a leather chair that probably cost more than she made in 3 months. Elena tested her legs, relieved to find them steady despite the previous night's ordeal, and made her way to the windows that dominated the far wall. The view was breathtaking in a way that made her feel dizzy, the city spread out below like a living map of streets and buildings stretching to the horizon. She was higher up than she'd ever been before, far removed from the ground-level reality where Hassan had died and where men with guns still searched for her. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation, and Elena felt her heart rate spike before she remembered where she was. Dante's voice came through the heavy wood, calm and reassuring in the morning light. Elena, are you awake? I have coffee and breakfast if you're hungry. She realized she was still wearing her torn and blood-stained uniform from the convenience store, the fabric stiff with dried rain and terror sweat. The thought of facing Dante looking like a disaster survivor made her acutely aware of how far she was from her normal world, but she didn't have any other clothes and couldn't exactly ask him to take her shopping under the circumstances. "Come in," Elena called, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to look more presentable. Dante entered carrying a silver tray that held what appeared to be an elaborate breakfast, complete with fresh flowers and delicate china that looked like it belonged in a museum. He was dressed more casually than the night before, in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt that somehow made him look even more dangerous than the expensive suit had. Elena found herself studying his face in the morning light, noting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the way his dark eyes seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. "How did you sleep?" Dante asked, setting the tray on a small table near the sitting area. "You were exhausted when I brought you up here." Elena made her way over to examine the breakfast offerings, amazed by the variety and presentation. Fresh fruit arranged like artwork, pastries that looked like they'd come from an expensive bakery, coffee that smelled better than anything she'd ever encountered. The contrast between this luxury and her usual breakfast of gas station coffee and whatever was about to expire in her refrigerator was so stark that it felt almost surreal. "Better than I expected," Elena admitted, settling into the leather chair across from him. "I thought I'd have nightmares, but I think I was too exhausted to dream." "That's normal after trauma," Dante said, pouring coffee into delicate cups that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. "Your mind needs time to process what happened before it can make sense of it during sleep." Elena accepted the coffee with hands that were steadier than they'd been the night before, grateful for the warmth and the rich flavor that was unlike anything she'd ever tasted. She found herself studying Dante over the rim of her cup, wondering how someone involved in organized crime could seem so cultured and considerate. He moved with the same careful grace she'd noticed the night before, but in daylight she could see intelligence and complexity in his dark eyes that challenged her assumptions about dangerous men. "This is beautiful," Elena said, gesturing toward the breakfast spread. "Do you always eat like this?" Dante's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe in surrounding myself with beauty when possible," he said simply. "Life is difficult enough without making it unnecessarily harsh." Elena thought about her own apartment with its second-hand furniture and bare walls, the way she'd convinced herself that luxury was shallow and unnecessary when the truth was she'd never had enough money to afford anything beautiful. Sitting in Dante's elegant penthouse, surrounded by artwork and fine furnishings, she began to understand that there might be value in beauty for its own sake, in creating spaces that nourished the soul rather than simply providing shelter. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said, setting down her coffee cup with careful precision. Dante nodded, his attention focused entirely on her in a way that was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. She'd grown accustomed to being invisible, to being the kind of person others looked through rather than at. But Dante's dark eyes seemed to see everything about her with uncomfortable clarity. "Last night you said Hassan was under your protection," Elena began, choosing her words carefully. "What does that mean exactly? How does that world work?" Dante was quiet for a long moment, and Elena watched conflicting emotions cross his features before he settled on what appeared to be careful honesty. "There are neighborhoods in this city where the police can't or won't provide adequate protection," he said finally. "Business owners who want to operate safely sometimes make arrangements with people who can provide what the legal system cannot." Elena felt a chill despite the warm sunlight streaming through the windows. "You're talking about extortion," she said quietly. "Protection money. I'm talking about a service provided to people who need it," Dante replied, his voice taking on a harder edge. The Castellano family was muscling into territory they had no right to claim, threatening people who had existing arrangements for protection. Hassan was caught in the middle of a territorial dispute that had nothing to do with him personally. Elena tried to process the casual way he spoke about territorial disputes and protection arrangements, as if violence and criminal enterprise were simply business matters requiring management rather than moral questions with clear right and wrong answers. She'd grown up believing in law and order, in the idea that good and evil were distinct categories, but Dante's world seemed to operate by different rules entirely. "The men who killed Hassan," Elena said, needing to understand the full scope of the threat. They were from this Castellano family? Dante's expression darkened, and Elena saw something lethal flicker in his eyes before he regained control. They were, he confirmed. And killing Hassan was a message intended for me. They wanted to demonstrate that my protection wasn't absolute, that they could strike at people under my care without consequences. Elena felt her breath catch as the implications of his words sank in. Hassan hadn't just been a casualty of criminal violence. He'd been murdered specifically to send a message to Dante, which meant his death was connected to whatever conflict existed between different criminal organizations. The weight of that knowledge made her feel sick, the idea that a good man had died simply to prove a point in someone else's war. That's why you feel responsible, Elena said, understanding beginning to dawn. It wasn't random. They killed him to hurt you. Dante nodded, his jaw tight with what appeared to be carefully controlled anger. And now they want to kill you for the same reason, he said quietly. Because keeping you alive proves that my protection means something, and letting you die would suggest that I'm weak enough to be challenged. Elena set down her pastry, her appetite completely gone as she realized the full scope of her situation. She wasn't just a witness who needed to be eliminated to prevent testimony. She was a symbol in a criminal war between different organizations, and her survival or death would send messages about power and territory that she didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. I never wanted to be part of this, Elena whispered, feeling tears threaten despite her efforts to stay composed. I was just trying to make rent and pay my bills. I was nobody important. Dante reached across the small table and covered her hand with his, the contact warm and surprisingly comforting despite everything she knew about him. You're important to me, he said with quiet intensity. That makes you important in my world, regardless of what you were before. Elena looked down at their joined hands, noting the contrast between his strength and her fragility, the way his fingers seemed designed to both protect and destroy depending on circumstance. She should be terrified of him, should be looking for ways to escape his protection and return to her normal life. But the truth was that her normal life no longer existed. The men who'd killed Hassan had seen to that when they decided she was a threat worth eliminating. Can I see more of your home? Elena asked, needing to move away from the heavy conversation before she broke down completely. I'd like to understand more about who you are. Dante's expression softened, and he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. Of course, he said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. I'll give you the full tour. Elena followed him out of the guest room and into the main living space, where morning light revealed details she'd missed in the chaos of the previous night. The penthouse was enormous, with soaring ceilings and an open floor plan that created intimate conversation areas within the larger space. Everything was elegant without being ostentatious, expensive without being showy, the kind of understated luxury that suggested confidence rather than insecurity about status. Dante guided her through a gourmet kitchen that looked like something from a magazine, complete with professional appliances and marble countertops that gleamed in the morning sun. Elena found herself imagining what it would be like to cook in such a space, to have access to every tool and ingredient she could possibly want, before remembering that she was only a temporary guest in this world of luxury and danger. You cook? Elena asked, running her hand along the smooth marble surface of the central island. I find it relaxing, Dante replied, opening a cabinet to reveal an impressive collection of spices and gourmet ingredients. There's something satisfying about creating something beautiful from simple components. It requires patience and attention to detail, qualities that serve me well in other areas of my life. Elena tried to reconcile the image of this dangerous man carefully preparing meals with her assumptions about criminal leaders, but the evidence was all around her in the form of well-used cookware and carefully organized ingredients. She was beginning to understand that Dante was far more complex than she'd initially assumed, a man who could eliminate threats with lethal efficiency while also appreciating beauty and creating elaborate breakfasts for traumatized witnesses. The rest of the penthouse revealed similar contradictions. A library filled with leather-bound classics alongside modern literature, artwork that suggested sophisticated taste, a home office that managed to look both professional and welcoming. Everything spoke of intelligence and refinement, of someone who valued education and culture despite operating outside the boundaries of conventional society. It's beautiful, Elena said as they completed the tour in a sitting room that offered another spectacular view of the city. Everything is so thoughtfully arranged. It feels more like a home than just an expensive apartment. Dante settled onto a leather sofa and gestured for her to join him, his dark eyes holding hers with that same intense focus she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "I believe our environment shapes who we become," he said quietly. "Surround yourself with beauty and intelligence, and you become more beautiful and intelligent. Surround yourself with ugliness and stupidity, and you diminish yourself." Elena thought about her own sparse apartment, the way she'd convinced herself that material possessions weren't important when the truth was she'd never had the resources to create anything truly beautiful. Sitting in Dante's carefully curated space, she began to understand that there was value in surrounding herself with things that inspired and uplifted rather than simply accepting whatever was cheapest or most practical. "Tell me about your family," Dante said, his voice gentle but curious. "What was your life like before last night?" Elena felt her chest tighten as memories she'd tried to bury came flooding back. Her family was a complicated subject, full of pain and disappointment that she rarely discussed with anyone. But something about Dante's patient attention and genuine interest made her want to share pieces of herself she usually kept hidden. "There's not much to tell," Elena said, looking down at her hands to avoid his penetrating gaze. "My father left when I was 12, and my mother spent the next 6 years telling me it was my fault for being difficult to love. I moved out the day I turned 18 and haven't spoken to her since." Elena could feel Dante's attention intensify, though his expression remained carefully neutral. She'd learned to tell her family story in a matter-of-fact tone that discouraged sympathy or follow-up questions, but somehow she found herself continuing with details she rarely shared. "I thought I'd found love in college," Elena continued, her voice growing quieter. "Marcus seemed different from my father, stable and dependable, and genuinely interested in building a future together. We dated for 3 years, and I thought we were going to get married after graduation." The memory of Marcus still had the power to hurt, even years later. He'd been her first real love, the first person who'd made her believe she was worthy of devotion and commitment, right up until the moment he'd proven her mother's words about being difficult to love completely accurate. "What happened?" Dante asked, his voice holding none of the judgment or impatience she'd learned to expect when discussing her romantic history. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself for the part of the story that always made her feel small and worthless. "He found someone better," she said simply. "Someone prettier and more confident and less damaged by her family history. He didn't even break up with me properly, just started avoiding my calls until I finally confronted him, and he admitted he'd been seeing his study partner for 2 months. Dante's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Elena caught a glimpse of something dangerous in his dark eyes before he controlled his expression. "Marcus was an idiot who didn't deserve you," he said with quiet conviction. "A real man doesn't abandon someone he claims to love because she carries scars from surviving a difficult childhood." The simple statement hit Elena harder than she'd expected, partly because Dante's tone suggested he genuinely believed what he was saying rather than just offering empty comfort. She'd spent years internalizing Marcus's rejection, accepting his implicit message that her emotional baggage made her too difficult to love permanently. "I spent the next few years learning to be completely self-sufficient," Elena continued, needing to finish the story now that she'd started. "I told myself that depending on anyone else was dangerous, that being alone was better than being abandoned again. I built a life where I didn't need anyone for anything." Elena thought about her carefully controlled existence, the way she'd chosen jobs and apartments and routines that required no emotional investment from others. She'd convinced herself that independence was strength, that needing nothing from anyone else was the key to avoiding further heartbreak. "And now?" Dante asked softly. "How do you feel about needing someone for protection?" Elena met his eyes, surprised by the vulnerability in her own voice when she answered. "Terrified," she admitted, "and grateful, and confused about why you're helping me when you barely know me." Dante leaned forward slightly, his attention focused entirely on her face. "Sometimes we recognize something in another person that calls to us," he said quietly. "Something that makes their well-being matter more than logic would suggest it should. That's what happened when I saw you in that alley, Elena." I knew immediately that keeping you safe was going to be the most important thing in my world. Elena felt her breath catch at the intensity in his voice, at the way his dark eyes seemed to see straight through every defense she'd built over the years. She should be terrified by his obvious interest, should be looking for ways to escape before she became even more entangled in his dangerous world. But instead she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by the safety and acceptance he represented. A sharp knock at the penthouse door interrupted the moment, and Elena watched Dante's entire demeanor shift from gentle protector to something far more dangerous. He was on his feet instantly, one hand moving to what she now realized was a concealed weapon while his eyes scanned the room for potential threats. "Stay here," Dante ordered, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "Don't move from this spot until I tell you it's safe." Elena pressed herself back into the sofa cushions, watching as Dante moved toward the door with predatory grace. Through the intercom system, she heard a voice she didn't recognize speaking rapid Italian, and Dante's response carried an edge that made her shiver. When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was grim. "What is it?" Elena asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The Castellanos made another move," Dante said, settling beside her on the sofa, but maintaining the alertness of someone ready for violence. "They hit one of my restaurants this morning, sent a message that they're not backing down despite what happened to their men last night." Elena felt the temporary peace of the morning shatter as reality crashed back over her. She'd allowed herself to forget for a few hours that she was trapped in the middle of a criminal war, that men who'd already proven willing to kill were actively hunting her, while Dante fought to protect both her and his criminal empire. "Does this change anything?" Elena asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "For my safety, I mean." Dante's expression softened as he turned his full attention back to her, and Elena found herself focusing on the warmth in his dark eyes rather than the implications of escalating violence. "Nothing changes my commitment to keeping you safe," he said with quiet conviction. "If anything, it makes me more determined to end this conflict quickly and completely." There was something in his tone that made Elena believe him completely, something that suggested his protection wasn't conditional on circumstances remaining manageable or convenient. As the morning light continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the beauty and luxury of his carefully created world, Elena found herself thinking that maybe accepting the protection of a dangerous man wasn't the worst fate that could befall someone who'd lost everything else. At least with Dante, she might live long enough to discover who she could become when she wasn't afraid all the time. Elena woke to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently against the nightstand, pulling her from the first peaceful sleep she'd experienced in months. For a moment, she forgot where she was, expecting to see the familiar cracks in her studio apartment ceiling instead of the elegant molding that decorated Dante's guest room. The events of the past 2 days felt surreal in the morning light, like fragments of a vivid dream that couldn't possibly be her actual life. The phone continued buzzing, and Elena reached for it with hands that were steadier than they'd been since witnessing Hassan's murder. The caller ID showed her friend Melissa's number, and Elena felt a pang of longing for the normal world she'd left behind. Melissa worked at the insurance office downtown and knew nothing about criminal empires or protection arrangements, nothing about the dangerous complexities that now defined Elena's existence. "Elena, thank God you're okay," Melissa said the moment Elena answered, her voice tight with worry and confusion. "Have you seen the news about Derek?" Elena felt her blood run cold at the mention of her ex-boyfriend's name. Derek Martinez had made her life miserable for 6 months after their breakup, showing up at her workplace and apartment to demand second chances while making increasingly threatening remarks about what would happen if she kept rejecting him. She'd filed 2 police reports that had accomplished nothing except making Derek more careful about his harassment tactics. "What about Derek?" Elena asked, though something in her chest already knew what Melissa was going to tell her. "He's missing," Melissa said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The police found his car abandoned near the river with no sign of him anywhere. They're calling it suspicious circumstances, Elena. They think something bad happened to him." Elena sat up in bed, her heart racing as Dante's promise from 2 nights ago echoed in her memory. "Every man who hurt you will disappear by morning." At the time, she'd thought it was an emotional declaration rather than a literal statement of intention, but the timing of Derek's disappearance suggested otherwise. When did this happen? Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady while her mind processed the implications. Sometime last night, Melissa replied. His roommate reported him missing when he didn't come home, and they found the car this morning. Elena, I know you two had a messy breakup, but you should probably call the police and let them know where you were last night, just in case they have questions. Elena ended the call with promises to be careful and stay in touch, but her mind was reeling from the confirmation of what she'd suspected. Derek's disappearance wasn't random or coincidental. Dante had made good on his promise to eliminate threats to her safety, and her abusive ex-boyfriend had been the first target on his list. A soft knock at the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts, and Dante entered carrying another elegant breakfast tray. He was dressed impeccably as always, in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Elena's annual income, but something in his expression told her he already knew about Derek's disappearance. Good morning, Dante said, setting the tray on the small table near the windows. I trust you slept well? Elena studied his face, looking for any sign of guilt or satisfaction that might confirm her suspicions about Derek's fate. Instead, she found only the same careful attention and genuine concern that had characterized all of his interactions with her since the night of Hassan's murder. My friend just called, Elena said carefully. She told me that Derek Martinez, my ex-boyfriend, has disappeared. The police found his car abandoned near the river. Dante poured coffee into delicate china cups, his movements precise and unhurried despite the weight of her words. I'm sorry to hear that your friend is worried, he said without looking up. Disappearances in this city are unfortunately more common than they should be. Elena felt frustration building in her chest at his deliberately neutral response. She needed to know the truth about what he'd done, needed to understand the full scope of the protection he'd promised. The moral implications of Derek's disappearance were staggering, but she found herself more concerned about Dante's honesty than his methods. Did you kill him? Elena asked directly, her voice sharper than she'd intended. Did you make Derek disappear because of what he did to me? Dante finally met her eyes, and Elena saw something complex and unreadable in his dark gaze. Derek Martinez made your life miserable for months after you ended your relationship, he said quietly. He threatened you, stalked you, and made you afraid to be alone in your own home. The police did nothing to protect you despite multiple reports. Elena's breath caught as she realized he knew details about her relationship with Derek that she'd never shared with him. The scope of his knowledge suggested he'd conducted a thorough investigation into her background, uncovering threats and problems she'd thought were private. How do you know all of that? Elena whispered, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical danger. I told you that your safety was my responsibility, Dante replied, settling into the chair across from her. That means understanding every threat you've faced, past and present. Derek was a problem that needed to be resolved. Elena tried to process the casual way he spoke about resolving problems that involved making people disappear completely. The rational part of her mind screamed that she should be horrified by his actions, should be looking for ways to escape before she became complicit in whatever criminal enterprise he represented. But another part of her, a part that had lived in fear of Derek's escalating harassment, felt something that might have been relief. What about Tom Harrison? Elena asked, naming the middle manager at her previous job who'd made her work environment unbearable with constant inappropriate comments and wandering hands. She'd quit rather than deal with his harassment, giving up a steady paycheck rather than endure his daily violations of her boundaries. Dante's expression didn't change, but Elena caught a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes before he regained control. What about him? Dante asked in return. Elena pulled up the news app on her phone, her suspicions confirmed when she found the story buried in the local section. Tom Harrison, 45, had been found unconscious in his garage the previous evening, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. He was hospitalized in serious condition with injuries the police were describing as consistent with a professional beating. You didn't kill him, Elena said, her voice holding a mixture of relief and confusion, but you made sure he wouldn't hurt anyone else. Dante sipped his coffee calmly, studying Elena's face as she processed the scope of his systematic approach to eliminating threats from her life. Some problems require permanent solutions, he said finally. Others simply need clear communication about changed circumstances. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes as the full weight of what Dante had done settled over her. He'd taken action against every man who'd made her feel unsafe, who'd violated her boundaries or threatened her well-being. The police had done nothing when she'd reported Derek's harassment, and her previous employer had ignored her complaints about Tom's inappropriate behavior. But Dante had resolved both situations within 24 hours of learning about them. Why? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Why would you go to such lengths for someone you barely know? Dante leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Because you matter to me, he said simply. Because you deserve protection that no one else was willing to provide. Because making you safe makes me feel like something more than just another criminal who profits from other people's fear. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a wall she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble under the weight of his actions and his words. She'd spent years convinced that no one would ever care enough to truly protect her, that she was destined to handle every threat and every problem by herself. But Dante had systematically eliminated dangers she'd learned to live with, threats she'd accepted as unchangeable parts of her reality. I should be horrified by what you've done, Elena said, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I should be afraid of you and looking for ways to escape before I become complicit in violence and criminal activity. But you're not, Dante said, his voice holding a certainty that suggested he could see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. Elena shook her head, surprised by her own emotional honesty. No, I'm not, she admitted. I feel safer sitting here with you than I've felt anywhere else in years. I feel protected and valued and cared for in a way that I never thought was possible. Dante rose from his chair and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body and catch the subtle scent of his expensive cologne. His hand came up to cup her cheek, thumb brushing away tears with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of making people disappear. You are protected, Dante said softly. You are valued and cared for and safe in ways that go beyond anything you've experienced before. But I need you to understand what accepting my protection means, Elena. I need you to know that once you choose this world, there's no going back to the life you had before. Elena leaned into his touch, her eyes falling closed as she processed the weight of his words. He was asking her to make a choice between the safety of his dangerous world and the vulnerability of conventional life, between being treasured by a criminal and being ignored by law-abiding society. When she opened her eyes and met his gaze, she found her answer in the warmth and acceptance she saw there. I don't want to go back, Elena whispered, her voice holding a conviction that surprised her. The life I had before was small and lonely and full of fear. At least with you, I matter to someone. Dante's expression softened, and Elena saw something tender and vulnerable flicker across his features before he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question rather than a demand, but when Elena responded by melting against him, he deepened it with careful passion. Elena had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such focused attention and deliberate tenderness. Dante kissed her like she was precious, like her pleasure and comfort were the only things that mattered in the world. His hand threaded through her hair while his mouth moved against hers with a skill that made her forget every fear and doubt that had plagued her for years. When they finally broke apart, Elena felt breathless and transformed, like something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what it meant to be wanted. Dante's dark eyes searched her face, looking for any sign of regret or uncertainty, but Elena found only gratitude and growing desire for this dangerous man who'd made her safety his personal mission. There's something else you need to know, Dante said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. My people have been investigating the men who killed Hassan, trying to understand why the Castellanos targeted him specifically. Elena felt a chill despite the warmth of Dante's arms around her. What did they find? She asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Hassan wasn't just a random target, Dante replied, his expression growing serious. He was specifically chosen because someone knew you worked there, knew you'd be likely to witness whatever happened. This wasn't about territory or protection money, Elena. It was about forcing you into a position where you'd need protection, where you'd have no choice but to accept help from someone in my world. Elena felt the room spinning slightly as the implications of his words sank in. The murder that had destroyed her normal life and forced her into Dante's protection hadn't been random criminal violence. Someone had orchestrated Hassan's death specifically to trap her in circumstances that would require criminal intervention. Who would do that? Elena asked, her voice barely audible. Who would kill an innocent man just to manipulate my life? Dante's arms tightened around her, and Elena felt his body tense with carefully controlled anger. Someone who wanted to use you to get to me, he said quietly. Someone who knew that protecting you would become more important to me than protecting my own interests. Elena looked into Dante's dark eyes and saw the truth he hadn't yet spoken aloud. Someone had recognized that she would matter to him, that her safety would become his weakness, and they'd murdered Hassan to create the circumstances that would bind them together. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have made her question every emotion she'd developed over the past few days. But instead she found herself pressing closer to him, choosing his dangerous devotion over the illusion of safety anywhere else. I choose you, Elena whispered against his lips. I choose this world and this protection and whatever comes with being yours. I choose you over everything else. Dante's response was immediate and intense, his mouth claiming hers with a passion that spoke of possession and promise and permanent commitment. As Elena lost herself in his kiss, she realized that accepting the protection of a dangerous man wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of something entirely new, something that might finally make her feel truly alive. The charity gala was held in the ballroom of the Meridian Hotel, and Elena had never felt more out of place in her entire life. The elegant black dress Dante had chosen for her probably cost more than she'd made in 2 months at Hassan's store, and the diamonds at her throat were real enough to make her nervous about accidentally damaging something worth more than her entire previous existence. But Dante had insisted that appearing in public together would send a clear message to the Castellano family that their intimidation tactics had failed completely. Elena moved through the crowd of wealthy donors and socialites with Dante's hand resting possessively on her lower back, his touch simultaneously comforting and protective. She could feel eyes following them wherever they went, whispered conversations dying abruptly when they approached groups of elegantly dressed guests. Everyone seemed to know who Dante was, and by extension, everyone now knew that she was under his protection. You're tense, Dante murmured against her ear as they approached the bar. His breath was warm against her skin, and Elena found herself leaning into his strength despite the crowd of strangers surrounding them. Remember, you belong here tonight. You're not hiding anymore. Elena accepted a glass of champagne from the bartender, marveling at how natural Dante looked in this world of expensive suits and political connections. He moved through the crowd with the same predatory grace she'd noticed from the beginning, but here it was disguised as social charm and business networking. Watching him interact with judges and city councilmen, Elena began to understand the scope of his influence extended far beyond criminal enterprises. Marco Castellano is here tonight, Dante said quietly, his tone casual despite the weight of his words. He's been watching us since we arrived, probably waiting for an opportunity to make some kind of statement. Elena felt her heart rate spike as she scanned the crowd, looking for threats among the sea of formal wear and fake smiles. The idea that Hassan's killers were in the same room, pretending to be respectable members of society, made her feel sick with rage and fear in equal measure. Which one is he? Elena asked, trying to keep her voice steady while her eyes continued searching the ballroom for danger. Dante guided her toward a quiet alcove near the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city lights below. He's the heavy-set man in the navy suit talking to the district attorney, Dante said, subtly indicating a direction with his champagne glass. The one who keeps glancing our way while pretending to discuss municipal bonds. Elena spotted Marco Castellano immediately, recognizing something cold and calculating in his expression that reminded her of the masked men who'd chased her through dark alleys. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 60, with silver hair and the kind of expensive tailoring that suggested legitimate business success alongside his criminal enterprises. The contrast between his respectable appearance and what she knew about his methods made Elena feel nauseated. He looks so normal, Elena said, surprised by how ordinary evil could appear when dressed in formal wear and surrounded by pillars of the community. The most dangerous predators always do, Dante replied, his arm tightening around her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. They rely on people's assumptions about what monsters look like to hide in plain sight. Elena was about to respond when she noticed two men in dark suits moving purposefully through the crowd toward their alcove. Something in their focused approach and the way their hands remained carefully positioned near their jacket pockets made her instinctively step closer to Dante, who had also noticed their advance. "Time to go," Dante said quietly, his entire demeanor shifting from charming socialite to something far more dangerous. His hand moved to her elbow, guiding her toward a side exit while his eyes tracked the approaching threats. "Stay close to me and do exactly what I tell you." Elena felt adrenaline flooding her system as they moved quickly but casually through the crowd, trying not to create panic among the innocent guests while evading what were obviously hostile operatives. The elegant ballroom suddenly felt like a trap, all those well-dressed witnesses providing cover for violence while making it impossible to respond effectively to threats. They reached the side exit just as Elena heard the first shouts from behind them, the sound of disruption cutting through the gentle murmur of polite conversation. Dante pushed open the heavy door and pulled her into a service corridor that was mercifully empty, his movements efficient and purposeful as he navigated the hotel's back passages. "Where are we going?" Elena asked, struggling to keep up in her elegant heels while Dante moved with the speed of someone intimately familiar with emergency evacuations. "Somewhere I can protect you properly," Dante replied, pulling out his phone and speaking rapid Italian to someone on the other end. "The hotel has too many civilians, too many ways for them to use innocent people as leverage." Elena heard footsteps echoing in the corridor behind them, multiple sets moving with military precision that suggested professional training and serious intent. The Castellano family had obviously planned this confrontation carefully, using the charity gala as cover for what was clearly intended to be either a kidnapping or an assassination. Dante led her through a maze of service corridors and emergency stairwells, his knowledge of the building's layout suggesting he'd prepared for exactly this kind of scenario. Elena found herself admiring his calm efficiency even while terror made her heart race. The way he could shift from elegant escort to lethal protector without missing a step. They emerged into the hotel's underground parking garage, where a black SUV waited with the engine running and two men in dark suits standing guard. Elena recognized the vehicle as identical to the one that had saved her life the night Hassan died, and she felt a surge of relief at the sight of Dante's reinforcements. "Get her to the safe house," Dante ordered, opening the passenger door and helping Elena inside. "Keep her there until you hear from me directly." Elena grabbed his arm before he could step away from the vehicle, sudden panic overwhelming her at the thought of being separated from him when danger was so close. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice tight with fear. "You can't leave me now." Dante's expression softened, and he cupped her face in his hands with surprising gentleness despite the urgency of their situation. "This ends tonight, Elena," he said quietly. "The Castellanos have made their move, and now I'm going to make mine. I won't let them threaten you again." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to demand that he prioritize his own safety over ending this conflict, but the sound of approaching footsteps in the stairwell made further discussion impossible. Dante kissed her hard and fast, a promise and a goodbye wrapped into one desperate moment, before stepping back and closing the SUV door. The vehicle pulled away from the hotel with Elena pressed against the rear window, watching Dante disappear into the shadows of the parking garage while three armed men emerged from the stairwell in pursuit. She wanted to scream at the driver to stop, to turn around and help him, but she understood that staying would only make him vulnerable to the kind of tactics his enemies might use against her. The safe house turned out to be a nondescript apartment building in a neighborhood Elena didn't recognize, but the two men who escorted her upstairs treated her with the same careful respect she'd come to associate with Dante's organization. They settled her in a comfortable living room with coffee and assurances that Dante would contact her as soon as possible, but Elena couldn't sit still long enough to appreciate their attempts at hospitality. Hours passed with no word, and Elena found herself pacing the apartment while monitoring news channels for any reports of violence at the Meridian Hotel. The charity gala had apparently concluded without any public incidents, but that only made her more worried about what was happening behind the scenes, in the shadows where men like Dante conducted their business. Elena's phone finally rang at 3 in the morning, Dante's name appearing on the screen like an answer to desperate prayers. She answered before the first ring had finished, her voice breathless with relief and residual fear. "Are you safe?" Elena asked immediately, not bothering with greetings or pleasantries. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Dante replied, his voice tired but calm. "It's over, Elena. The Castellano threat has been permanently resolved." Elena felt tears of relief spilling down her cheeks as the weight of constant fear finally lifted from her shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, needing to understand how the conflict that had defined her new reality had been concluded. "Marco Castellano and his associates won't be threatening anyone again," Dante said simply. "The warehouse where they planned Hassan's murder became their final meeting place. Justice has been served for what they did to Hassan and what they tried to do to you." Elena understood the implications of his carefully chosen words, recognizing that he was protecting her from details she probably didn't want to know. The important thing was that the men who'd murdered Hassan and terrorized her were gone, eliminated by Dante's systematic approach to protecting what mattered to him. "I'm coming to get you," Dante continued. "We need to talk about what happens next, about what our life together looks like now that this threat has been resolved." Elena felt something warm and hopeful bloom in her chest at the phrase "our life together," at the casual assumption that they would continue as a partnership rather than temporary protector and protected. The thought of building something permanent with Dante, despite all the dangers and moral complexities of his world, felt more appealing than returning to the lonely independence she treasured before meeting him. When Dante arrived at the safe house, Elena was waiting by the door with barely contained emotion. The moment she saw him, she threw herself into his arms, needing the physical confirmation that he was alive and unharmed. His expensive suit was rumpled and he looked exhausted, but his dark eyes held the same warmth and intensity that had captured her from the beginning. "It's really over?" Elena asked, studying his face for any sign that threat still remained. Dante pulled her closer, his arms tightening around her as if he never intended to let her go again. "It's over," he confirmed. "The people who killed Hassan are dead. The conspiracy that targeted you has been eliminated, and everyone in this city now understands that you're under my permanent protection." Elena felt the last of her fear melting away as she processed the finality in his voice. She was safe, truly safe, for the first time since witnessing Hassan's murder. More than that, she was claimed by a man powerful enough to make that safety absolute, to ensure that no one would ever threaten her again. "What does that mean for us?" Elena asked, her voice soft with hope and uncertainty. "Where do we go from here?" Dante's answer came in the form of a kiss that was deeper and more possessive than anything they'd shared before, a claiming that spoke of permanent commitment and absolute devotion. When they finally broke apart, Elena found her answer in the heat of his dark eyes and the way his hands held her like she was the most precious thing in his dangerous world. "We build a life together," Dante said simply. "We create something beautiful and lasting from all this violence and chaos. We prove that love can exist even in the darkest places, Elena. We prove that some things are worth fighting for." Elena looked into his eyes and realized that choosing his dangerous world over conventional safety wasn't a sacrifice, but a victory. The first time in her life, she'd chosen to be valued and protected rather than independent and alone. In Dante's arms, surrounded by the aftermath of violence and the promise of permanent protection, Elena finally understood what it meant to be truly safe. 3 months after the night that had changed everything, Elena woke in Dante's bed with sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the profound sense of contentment that came from being exactly where she belonged. The penthouse had become truly home rather than sanctuary, filled with her books alongside his art collections, her photographs sharing wall space with expensive paintings, her laughter echoing through rooms that had once felt elegant but cold. Dante was already awake beside her, propped up on one elbow as he watched her with the same intense focus that had characterized their entire relationship. His dark hair was tousled from sleep, and the morning light highlighted the sharp angles of his face, while softening the dangerous edge that most people saw when they looked at him. Elena had learned to see past that edge to the complex man beneath, someone capable of breathtaking tenderness alongside lethal efficiency. "Good morning, beautiful," Dante said, his voice rough with sleep and affection. His hand came up to stroke her hair, fingers threading through the dark waves with gentle possessiveness. "How did you sleep?" Elena stretched languidly, enjoying the feel of silk sheets against her skin and the warmth of Dante's body beside her. "Better than I ever did before," she replied honestly. "I never realized how exhausting it was to be afraid all the time until I stopped being afraid." The transformation had been gradual but profound, Elena's nervous hypervigilance slowly fading as she'd learned to trust in Dante's protection completely. She no longer jumped at unexpected sounds or automatically scanned every room for exits and threats. The constant tension that had defined her adult life had dissolved, replaced by a confidence she'd never imagined possible. Dante leaned down to press a soft kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering against her skin as if he was savoring the simple intimacy of the moment. "I have a meeting this morning," he said reluctantly. "New business ventures that require my attention. But I was hoping you'd join me afterward to review the hotel acquisition contracts." Elena felt a surge of satisfaction at being included in his business decisions. Over the past months, Dante had begun involving her in the legitimate aspects of his empire, recognizing that her analytical mind and attention to detail were valuable assets in complex negotiations. She discovered an aptitude for business strategy that had been completely wasted in her previous life of service jobs and survival mode thinking. "I'd love to," Elena replied, already mentally reviewing the files she'd studied the night before. "I have some thoughts about the zoning restrictions that might affect the renovation timeline." Dante's expression brightened with genuine appreciation for her contributions, and Elena felt the familiar warmth that came from being valued for her intelligence rather than simply tolerated for her presence. He never made her feel like her lack of formal business education was a limitation, instead encouraging her natural instincts and providing resources for learning whatever she needed to know. They made their way to the kitchen together, moving through the familiar morning routine that had developed organically over the months of living together. Dante prepared elaborate breakfast spreads that showcased his culinary skills, while Elena handled coffee preparation with the expensive espresso machine he'd taught her to operate with obsessive precision. The morning news played quietly on the kitchen television, and Elena found herself only half listening to reports of city politics and economic developments that had once seemed irrelevant to her life. Living with Dante had given her a new perspective on how the city actually functioned, the complex web of relationships between legitimate business, political influence, and less conventional power structures. "The Riverside Hotel deal should close by Friday," Dante said, sliding a perfectly prepared omelet onto her plate. "Once we own it outright, we can begin the renovation project and start converting more of the organization's assets into legitimate enterprises." Elena had watched with fascination as Dante systematically transformed his criminal empire into increasingly legal business ventures. The process was complex and gradual, requiring careful navigation of regulations and tax implications, but the result was a gradual legitimization that would provide them with sustainable income without the constant threat of legal prosecution. "How much of the transition do you think we can complete within the next year?" Elena asked, genuinely curious about the timeline for their transformation from criminal organization to legitimate business empire. Dante considered the question while they ate, his expression thoughtful and strategic. "Probably 60%, he said finally. "The protection services will take longer to phase out completely, but most of the financial operations can be converted to legal investment ventures within 12 months. Elena found herself admiring not just his business acumen, but his commitment to building something sustainable and honorable for their future together. She'd expected that accepting his criminal world would mean compromising her moral principles permanently, but instead she discovered that love could motivate transformation in directions she'd never anticipated. After breakfast, Elena settled into the home office that Dante had created for her, complete with multiple monitors and access to the same financial databases his other analysts used. She discovered an unexpected talent for pattern recognition and risk assessment, skills that translated remarkably well from surviving on very little money to managing large-scale investments and acquisitions. The hotel contracts were complex, involving multiple regulatory agencies and zoning complications that would challenge even experienced developers. But Elena found herself energized by the puzzle of making everything work together, by the satisfaction of solving problems that would benefit both their financial future and the broader community through job creation and urban renewal. Elena was deep in analysis when Dante returned from his meeting, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction that came from successful negotiations. She looked up from her screens to find him watching her with something that looked like pride mixed with deep affection. "How did your meeting go?" Elena asked, saving her work and turning to give him her full attention. "Very well," Dante replied, settling into the chair beside her desk. "The Port Authority has agreed to our terms for the shipping contracts, which means we can phase out the last of the questionable cargo operations within 6 months. Elena felt a surge of happiness at the news, knowing how important complete legitimization was to Dante's long-term plans. She'd come to understand that his criminal activities had been more about survival and protection than greed or violence for its own sake, and watching him systematically eliminate those aspects of his business felt like witnessing a redemption she'd never thought possible. "That's wonderful," Elena said, reaching out to take his hand. "It means we're really building something clean and sustainable together." Dante brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her palm, while his dark eyes held hers with familiar intensity. "We are," he agreed. "And that brings me to something I wanted to discuss with you." Elena felt her heart rate increase at the serious tone in his voice, though his expression suggested good news rather than problems requiring solutions. She'd learned to read his moods with increasing accuracy, recognizing the difference between business concerns and personal matters that required different kinds of attention. Dante reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box that made Elena's breath catch with recognition and hope. Over the past months, she'd occasionally caught herself wondering about marriage and permanent commitment, but she tried not to pressure him about formalizing their relationship when they were both still adjusting to the dramatic changes in their lives. "Elena Vasquez," Dante said, his voice soft with emotion as he opened the box to reveal a stunning diamond ring that caught the afternoon light and threw rainbows across the office walls. "You came into my life as someone I needed to protect, but you've become someone I can't imagine living without. Will you marry me and make this partnership official in every possible way?" Elena felt tears of joy spilling down her cheeks as she looked at the ring, then at Dante's face, seeing vulnerability and hope mixed with the confidence she'd come to associate with all his important decisions. The proposal felt like the natural culmination of everything they'd built together, the formal recognition of a bond that had already transformed them both. "Yes," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, absolutely yes." Dante slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly, and Elena marveled at seeing this powerful man nervous about something as simple as her acceptance of his proposal. The diamond fit perfectly, as if it had been designed specifically for her hand, and she suspected he'd been planning this moment for longer than she'd realized. When their kiss finally ended, Elena found herself laughing with pure joy at the thought of spending the rest of her life with someone who valued and protected her, while also challenging her to become the best version of herself. Marriage to Dante would mean permanent entry into his world, but that world had become home in ways she'd never expected when she'd first accepted his protection. The wedding planning consumed the following months, but in the best possible way. Elena discovered that she enjoyed organizing elaborate events almost as much as she enjoyed analyzing business contracts, and Dante seemed determined to give her every beautiful detail she'd ever dreamed of having. The ceremony would take place at his family estate in Sicily, surrounded by people who'd become genuine friends rather than simply business associates. Elena's estranged mother had initially been horrified by the news that her daughter was marrying someone with Dante's reputation, but a single conversation with Dante himself had changed her perspective completely. Elena watched in amazement as her mother, who'd spent years criticizing every choice Elena made, began talking proudly about her daughter's successful engagement to such an obviously devoted man. "He loves you," Elena's mother said during one of their regular phone calls that had resumed after years of silence. "I can see it in the way he looks at you, the way he talks about your future together. I was wrong about you being too difficult to love, "Sweetheart, you just needed to find the right person to appreciate what you have to offer." The acknowledgement meant more to Elena than she'd expected, healing wounds she'd carried for years while validating her choice to build a life with someone who treasured her completely. Dante's family had welcomed her with equal warmth, treating her not as an outsider who'd captured their patriarch's attention, but as someone who'd clearly made him happier than they'd seen him in years. 6 months after his proposal, Elena stood in an ancient chapel overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, wearing a dress that made her feel like royalty while promising to spend her life with the most complex and devoted man she'd ever known. Dante's vows, spoken in both English and Italian, brought tears to her eyes with their poetry and conviction. His promise to protect and cherish her for the rest of their lives delivered with the same absolute certainty he brought to everything important in his world. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Elena felt the final pieces of her transformation falling into place. She was no longer the frightened woman who'd witnessed a murder and needed rescue. She was Dante's partner, his advisor, his equal in every way that mattered, someone strong enough to stand beside him while building something extraordinary together. The reception was held at the family vineyard, with Elena wearing a different dress for dancing and celebration while surrounded by people who'd become genuine family. She watched Dante move through conversations with government officials, business partners, and family members, seeing how naturally he commanded respect while never losing sight of her presence across the room. As the evening wound down, Elena found herself standing on the vineyard terrace with Dante, looking out over rolling hills that would be part of their regular landscape now that they'd decided to split their time between Sicily and the United States. The transformation of their lives from crisis survival to this kind of deep contentment felt almost miraculous. "No regrets?" Dante asked, pulling her closer as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking about everything she'd gained and lost since the night Hassan died. Her old life of careful independence and emotional isolation was gone, but it had been replaced by partnership and purpose and the kind of love she'd never believed was possible for someone like her. "None," Elena said with absolute conviction. "This is the life I want, Dante. This world we've built together, this partnership we've created, this love that's made me stronger instead of smaller. I've never been happier." 2 years later, Elena sat in their Sicily office reviewing contracts for their newest hotel acquisition while their 6-month-old daughter, Sophia, napped in a designer crib positioned where Elena could watch her while working. The little girl had her father's dark hair and her mother's determination, and she was already showing signs of the strong personality that would serve her well in the complex world she'd inherited. Dante emerged from his own office carrying the financial reports Elena had requested, but his attention immediately went to their sleeping daughter before settling on Elena with the same warm intensity that had characterized their entire relationship. He'd proven to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, approaching parenthood with the same protective thoroughness he brought to everything important. "The quarterly numbers look excellent," Dante said, settling beside Elena to review the documents. "The hotel chain is exceeding projected revenues, and the shipping company is operating completely within legal parameters now." Elena felt deep satisfaction at the confirmation that their legitimate business empire was thriving beyond their most optimistic projections. They'd successfully transformed Dante's organization from criminal enterprise to respected corporation, providing jobs and economic development while building sustainable wealth for their growing family. "How did we get so lucky?" Elena asked, looking around at their beautiful office, their sleeping daughter, and the man who transformed her understanding of what love could accomplish. "I've been thinking about that connection you once had to difficult experiences, whether trauma shapes us or we shape our response to it. What's your perspective on how challenging circumstances can lead to unexpected growth and strength?" Elena realized she was asking not just about their specific story, but about the broader human capacity for transformation through love and partnership. Dante smiled, understanding immediately why she was reflecting on their journey from crisis to contentment. "We weren't lucky," he said softly. "We were brave enough to choose each other despite every reason to be afraid, smart enough to build something beautiful from terrible circumstances, and committed enough to keep growing together instead of apart." Elena looked at her wedding ring. then at their daughter, then at the panoramic view of vineyards and mountains that represented the life they'd created together. She'd started as a convenience store clerk living in fear, and now she was a business executive, devoted mother, and cherished wife who'd found strength she'd never known she possessed. Little Sophia stirred in her crib, making soft sounds that suggested she'd be waking soon for afternoon feeding. Elena and Dante moved together automatically, their partnership extending seamlessly from business decisions to parenting duties, two people who'd learned to function as a single unit while maintaining their individual strengths. As Elena lifted their daughter into her arms, feeling Sophia's warm weight and breathing in her sweet baby scent, she realized that being claimed by a dangerous man hadn't been the end of her independence, but the beginning of a different kind of strength. She'd found safety not by avoiding risk, but by choosing the right person to face dangers alongside, someone whose protection had never demanded that she become smaller or weaker in return. Outside their office windows, the Sicilian countryside stretched toward the horizon in endless possibilities, much like the future Elena could envision for their family. She learned that some transformations required courage rather than caution, that the greatest safety sometimes came from accepting love from someone powerful enough to make protection absolute. In Dante's arms, with their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, Elena finally understood that choosing his dangerous world over conventional safety hadn't been a compromise, but a victory. The moment she'd stopped surviving and started truly living.